The arena was silent. The cheers, the body slams, the roar of the crowd, all gone. As the doctors surrounded him, a hush fell over the world. A global icon, brought to his knees not by a pile driver, but by something far more sinister. They all thought it was over. But then, as he looked up, his eyes meeting the camera one last time, he whispered words that weren't for the crowd. They were for us. And what he said next left everyone in tears. This is the untold story of a hero's final stand. The sun-bleached sign for Sunnyside Springs Youth Wrestling Academy creaked in the gentle Florida breeze. Beneath it stood a man who was once a titan, a living legend etched into the collective memory of a generation. Terry Bollea, a.k.a. Hulk Hogan, now just Mr. B to the kids, ran his hand over the worn-out wood, a faint smile playing on his lips. His famous handlebar mustache, now streaked with silver, twitched with a familiar intensity. He wasn't in a sold-out arena. His audience was 24 wide-eyed teenagers grappling on a beat-up mat, their sweat and determination filling the small gym. This was his life now. The quiet, the mentorship, the peace. He had traded the roar of the crowd for the hopeful grunts of tomorrow's heroes. For the past 10 years, Terry had dedicated himself to this academy, a small non-profit sanctuary for at-risk youth. He taught them more than just headlocks and suplexes. He taught them about integrity, about respect, about the power of saying your prayers and eating your vitamins. The fortune, the larger-than-life persona. It was all a distant memory, a glorious, chaotic fever dream. Here, he was just a coach, a father figure, a man trying to make a difference. He thought he had found his final chapter, a quiet, fulfilling epilogue to a story of epic proportions. But stories, especially those as grand as his, have a way of refusing to end, and quietly, they demand one last twist, one final, unexpected turn. It started with a letter, not a fan letter or a bill or an invitation to a retro convention. It was a single, unmarked white envelope left on his desk one morning. The paper was heavy, the script elegant and archaic, almost like a prop from an old movie. Inside, there was no name, no address, just a single cryptic phrase. The shadow has come for what is owed. Terry scoffed. A prank, surely. One of the kids, or a rival gym. The wrestling world was full of drama, even in retirement. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash, a flicker of the old fiery spirit in his eyes. He had faced down giants, monsters, and a whole stable of villains. The shadow was just another paper tiger. But a week later, another letter arrived. This one was delivered by a young boy who simply handed it to one of the students and vanished. This time, the message was more direct, more sinister. The debt will be paid in the ring. A final match, Sunnyside Springs versus the Ghost of Glory. The note was accompanied by a single grainy photograph of a forgotten wrestling event from the early 80s, a local low-stakes match. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, was a man with a distinct, lanky frame. Terry squinted, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He remembered that match. It was one of his first, a small-time gig in a smoky bar. The opponent was a last-minute replacement, a jobber who got hurt and was never heard from again. The name on the photo's back, scribbled in the same archaic script, was Ghost. Terry dismissed it again, but the unsettling feeling lingered. A few days later, a video appeared on the Academy's website. It was an old, heavily edited highlight reel of Terry's early career, focusing not on his wins, but on the opponents he defeated. The tone was not celebratory, it was accusatory. The video's title flashed across the screen in jagged red letters. Hulk Hogan's Rise, built on the bones of the forgotten. The video ended with a slow-motion clip of that fateful match in the bar, a young Terry Bollea delivering a powerful slam, followed by a freeze frame of the unnamed opponent collapsing. The last shot was the same grainy photo from the letter. This was no prank. This was a challenge, a deeply personal one, from a ghost of his past. He went to the gym and found his students huddled around a tablet, the video playing on a loop. The questions in their eyes were a mix of confusion and fear. Was their hero, their coach, a villain in a forgotten story? Terry felt a familiar rage welling up inside him, but he knew he couldn't just lash out. The persona of Hulk Hogan, the hero, was not a shield here. It was the very thing being attacked. He had to be Mr. B, the mentor, the calm, collected leader. He gathered the students and spoke to them, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the bombastic persona he once embodied. "Listen up, guys," he said, gesturing to the tablet. "Some people don't like to see others succeed. They'll try to tear you down, dig up old things, and twist them into something they're not. This is one of those times." One of the students, a young girl named Maya, her face full of concern, spoke up. "But what's the ghost of glory? And what does he want, Mr. B?" Terry hesitated. He couldn't lie to them. He had to be honest, but without causing panic. "I don't know who this person is or what they're talking about, but it seems we have a grudge. It's a challenge, pure and simple. And we're not going to run from it. We're going to face it head on. Together." That night, alone in his office, Terry pulled out a box filled with old memorabilia. He dug through old photos, scrapbooks, and newspaper clippings. He found the program from that smoky bar match. The name of the opponent was indeed Ghost. No first name, no last name, just Ghost. A last-minute fill-in, a man who got a concussion and vanished. Terry had never thought about him again. He had been a stepping stone, a forgotten footnote in a legendary career. But now, that footnote had a name, a voice, and a vengeance. The next day, a large banner appeared hanging from the fence outside the academy. "The Ghost of Glory versus Hulk Hogan. Final showdown." A local news van was already parked across the street, the reporter setting up his camera. The news spread like wildfire. The kids were buzzing with nervous energy. Terry knew he had to act. He had to confront this ghost and put an end to this bizarre, painful chapter. But where would he find him? As if summoned by his thoughts, his old phone, a relic he kept for sentimental reasons, rang. The screen showed an unknown number. He answered it, the old familiar fire burning in his chest. "Terry Bollea," a voice crackled through the line, low and gravelly. "It's been a long time. You don't remember me, do you?" "I think I do, Ghost," Terry said, his voice a low growl. "What do you want?" "What I want is simple," the voice said, a dry, humorless chuckle on the other end. "I want the glory that was stolen from me, that match in that bar. I was on the cusp of something big. A scout was in the crowd. I was looking for a new talent. I was going to be the next big thing. But then you took it all away. You buried me, just like they buried my name." "That's not what happened," Terry protested. "You got hurt. It was an accident. It was the business." "No, Terry," the voice hissed. "It was you, your ambition, your glory. It blinded you. And now, I'm taking it back. We're going to have a match, just the two of us, in the old arena. And this time, there won't be any scouts, no TV cameras, just a final match, a final reckoning. Winner takes all." "And what is all?" Terry asked, his mind racing, trying to figure out the game this man was playing. "The academy," the voice said, and Terry's blood ran cold. "The deeds to Sunnyside Springs. If I win, the academy is mine. I'll shut it down. If you win, well, you already have your glory, don't you, Terry?" The crowd, the fame, the millions. So if you win, you get to keep the academy, but you'll have to face me and all the ghosts of your past, one last time. Terry gripped the phone, the cold metal digging into his palm. This wasn't about a match. It was about everything he had worked for, everything he had built to redeem himself. This was about the kids, about their dreams, about their future. This was about his legacy, not as a wrestling superstar, but as a man who had finally found his purpose. He took a deep breath, the old fire turning into a new, more potent kind of heat. It was the heat of a man with a purpose, a man with a mission. "You've got a match, Ghost," he said, his voice echoing with the confidence of a champion. "Tell me when and where." The call ended, leaving Terry in silence, the phone heavy in his hand. He looked around the empty office at the pictures of the kids, their smiling, hopeful faces. This wasn't just a wrestling match anymore. This was a battle for their future. This was a battle for his soul. He knew he couldn't tell the kids the whole truth. It would only scare them. He would have to handle this on his own. He looked at the old, dusty championship belt hanging on the wall, a symbol of a past life. He knew it was time to step back into the spotlight, not as the Hulk, but as Terry Bollea, the man who would do anything to protect the kids of Sunnyside Springs. The challenge had been laid down. The ghost of his past was calling him back into the ring, and Terry, for the first time in years, felt the old familiar rush of adrenaline. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had begun. He was ready. He spent the next few days in a whirlwind of preparation. He dusted off his old wrestling gear, the famous red and yellow. He trained, not with the kids, but alone, in the middle of the night, pushing his aging body to its limits. He ran. He lifted. He grappled with a ghost that only he could see. He knew this wasn't going to be a normal match. This was personal. This was a battle for more than just a championship belt. This was a battle for a home, a battle for a future. The kids of Sunnyside Springs were depending on him. He had to be ready. He had to win. He thought back to that day in the bar, to the match with the man they called Ghost. He remembered the feeling of being young, of being unstoppable, of the single-minded focus on winning, on making a name for himself. He remembered the slam, the roar of the small crowd, and the feeling of victory. He also remembered the blur of a man being carried away, a man who, he now realized, had become a casualty of his ambition. A deep pang of guilt washed over him. He had been so focused on his own glory that he had forgotten the other players in the game. He had forgotten the men who were on the other side of the ring, the men who were fighting for their own dreams. The thought was a sobering one, and it fueled his determination. This match isn't just to save the academy. It was for redemption. It was to finally put the ghost of his past to rest. The day of the match was set for a week later. The location, the old abandoned arena in the neighboring town, a place that had been a silent witness to 1,000 forgotten battles. Terry had a plan. He would face the ghost, he would win, and he would come back to the academy a hero. His legacy intact, his future secure. He would show the kids that even in the face of adversity, even when the past comes back to haunt you, you can still stand tall. You can still fight. You can still win. He was ready for the final twist, the final turn. He was ready for the ghost of glory. The old arena, once a bastion of thunderous applause and athletic grandeur, was now a hollow shell. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight, piercing through holes in the rusted roof. The air, thick with the smell of decay and forgotten dreams, was heavy with a silence that was more profound than any sound. Terry Bollea, dressed in his old red and yellow gear, stood in the center of the ratting, The canvas, once a pristine white, was now stained and torn, a silent testament to the years of neglect. He could almost hear the phantom echoes of a roaring crowd, the ghostly bell ringing out, the cheers and jeers that had once been his lifeblood. He adjusted his knee pads, the worn material feeling strangely comforting. This wasn't a comeback. It was a farewell, a final bow to a silent crowd. He was early, as he always was. He liked to take a moment to center himself, to become the Hulk once more, a process that was now more a mental exercise than a physical transformation. He had spent the last few days in a fog of self-doubt and guilt. Every ache in his joints, every tight muscle was a painful reminder of his age. He wasn't the unstoppable force he once was. He was just Terry, a man in his 60s, trying to fight a ghost from his past with a body that was no longer his ally. He remembered his old rivis, Al, a man who had famously said, "Father Time is undefeated." Terry was starting to feel the truth of that statement in his bones. A sudden noise from the bleachers made him stop. It wasn't the sound of a phantom crowd, but the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. He looked up, his heart sinking. There, in the shadows, were his kids, all 24 of them. Maya, the determined young girl, led the charge, her face a mix of defiance and worry. They scrambled down the crumbling steps and huddled at ringside, their faces lit with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "Mr. B, we couldn't let you do this alone," Maya yelled, her voice echoing in the vast empty space. "We found out where you were going. We knew you were worried. We're here for you." Another student, a lanky boy named Leo, piped up. "We know it's a big deal, Coach. The whole internet is talking about the ghost. But we also know you're the greatest. We've got your back." Their presence, their unwavering belief in him, was a double-edged sword. It filled him with an immense sense of pride and love, but it also made the stakes terrifyingly real. He wasn't just fighting for an academy anymore. He was fighting for their faith in him. He was fighting for their hope. As if on cue, a tall, shadowy figure emerged from the entrance ramp, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. He was dressed in black wrestling gear, a dark, menacing silhouette against the stark sunlight. He wore a mask, a simple black cloth with 2 jagged eye holes, a grim, humorless reflection of the ghost name. He moved with a quiet confidence, a stark contrast to Terry's deliberate veteran movements. He slid into the ring, his eyes dark and cold, fixed on Terry. "So you brought an audience," the ghost said, his voice muffled by the mask, but carrying a chilling, youthful intensity. "That's a nice touch, a final spectacle for the legend. But it won't change anything. You're fighting the past, Terry, and the past always wins." Terry stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "I don't know who you are, but you're not the man I fought all those years ago. The ghost was a good man. You're just a kid playing dress-up." The ghost's body tensed. "You think you know him. You think you know my father. You destroyed him, old man. You broke his neck, and you broke his spirit. He never wrestled again. He spent the rest of his life a broken man, a ghost of the wrestler he could have been. You remember that scout in the crowd? My father, David, he was a farm boy from Kansas, but he had heart. That night was his big break, his chance to make it to the big leagues, and you, in your rush to get to the top, you took that all away from him. He couldn't lift anything heavier than a cup of coffee after that. He couldn't even pick me up. He died a few years ago, a bitter, angry man, and all because of you." He took a step closer, his hands balled into fists. "I'm not a kid playing dress-up. I'm his son, and I'm here to collect what's owed. The glory you stole." The revelation hit Terry like a gut punch. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a random grudge. It was a son fighting for his father's honor. The guilt he had been feeling, The quiet, persistent shame now roared to life, a living, breathing thing in the ring with him. He had not just hurt a man. He had shattered a family. "I'm sorry," Terry said, the words barely a whisper. "I never knew. It was an accident. I swear. It was the business of crushing dreams." The ghost spat out, cutting him off. "That's all it was to you, a business. To us it was a life. And now I'm taking yours." The ghost charged, a blur of furious energy. Terry, caught off guard by the emotional blow, was unprepared. The ghost's moves were precise, calculated, a blend of classic wrestling with a modern, vicious edge. He was faster, stronger, younger. He landed a series of quiet, brutal blows, forcing Terry into the corner. The kids at ringside gasped, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. Their hero, the invincible Mr. B, was getting beaten. Terry was on the ropes, literally and metaphorically. The old fire, the passion, the adrenaline rush he had felt in the past few days now felt like a dying ember. He was too old for this. He was fighting a man with nothing to lose and a lifetime of resentment to fuel him. The ghost pulled him out of the corner and slammed him down with a force that rattled Terry's bones. He followed it up with a series of quick, merciless stomps to the chest. Terry lay on the mat, gasping for breath, the taste of dust and defeat on his tongue. The ghost stood over him, his chest heaving, his dark eyes filled with a furious satisfaction. "This is for my father," he hissed. And then, with a chilling calmness, he pulled a small, worn photograph from his pocket and tossed it onto Terry's chest. It was a picture of the original ghost, a young man with a hopeful, boyish grin, posing proudly in his wrestling gear. Terry looked at the photo, at the young man he had fought so long ago, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over him. He was on the brink of losing. The deed to Sunnyside Springs was practically already in the ghost's hands. The kids at ringside, their faces pale and scared, watched in silent horror. Their hero, their last hope, was about to fall. But then, as he looked up, past the ghost, past the crumbling rafters, he saw their faces. Maya's eyes were wide, but not with fear. They were filled with a burning, desperate hope. The other kids, too, were looking at him, their swollen, frantic pleas more powerful than any roar from a sold-out stadium. They weren't just an audience. They were his reason. They were his strength. He was fighting for them. He was fighting for their future. A tiny spark ignited in his chest. It wasn't the old, bombastic rage of the Hulkster. It was something deeper, something quieter, something more profound. It was the love of a father for his children, the fierce protectiveness of a mentor for his students. He had to get up. He had to fight. He had to win. With a groan, he pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. The ghost, surprised by his resilience, moved in for another attack. But this time, Terry was ready. He ducked under a wild swing, grabbed the ghost by the waist, and with a superhuman effort, lifted him into the air. A move he hadn't performed in years. He slammed him down with a primal roar, the impact shaking the entire ring. The kids at ringside erupted into a deafening cheer, a joyous noise that filled the silent, empty arena. The tide had turned. The ghost, stunned, staggered to his feet. Terry, fueled by a newfound energy, met him with a series of powerful clotheslines, the moves slow but deliberate, each one a promise, a vow. He was no longer fighting with his fists. He was fighting with his heart. He was fighting for the kids of Sunnyside Springs. The ghost, however, was not giving up. He dodged a punch and countered with a swift kick to Terry's knee, a brutal, targeted strike that sent a jolt of white-hot pain through the old wrestler's leg. Terry buckled, but refused to fall. He roared, not in pain, but in defiance, and grabbed the ghost in a powerful headlock. The two men struggled, their bodies twisting and contorting, a dance of fury and desperation. Just as Terry was about to deliver the final crushing blow, a third figure emerged from the shadows. He was a man in an expensive suit, his face a mask of cold, calculated cruelty. He held a document in his hand, and he moved with a quiet, menacing authority. "Hold on, Terry," he said, his voice a silken, sinister purr. "The match isn't over yet. We have a little surprise for you." He gestured to the ghost. "The boy thinks he's fighting for his father's honor. He thinks he's fighting for a grudge. But this is about a whole lot more. My name is Julian Cross, and I am the true Shadow. The debt you owe isn't just to one man. It's to a whole new organization. We're rebuilding the wrestling world from the ground up, starting with all the broken dreams of the past. We're a private equity firm, and we've been buying up all the old, forgotten properties, the forgotten stars, the forgotten academies. Your academy, Sunnyside Springs, is just the latest acquisition. I own the deed, Terry. This match. It was never about a title. It was about putting on a show, a final spectacle for my investors. The boy here, the ghost, he's just a pawn in my game. A bitter kid with a grudge, a tool I used to get you here. I'm the new owner of Sunnyside Springs. And this match, it's just the beginning of the show. The air in the arena, already heavy with dust and desperation, seemed to freeze. Julian Cross's words weren't just a new twist. They were a complete rewriting of the script. The emotional, deeply personal conflict between Terry and the ghost had been nothing more than a carefully orchestrated theatrical performance for a cold, corporate takeover. Terry, battered and bruised, felt a different kind of pain now, the piercing sting of a fool who had walked right into a trap. He looked from the smirking Julian Cross to the young man in the black mask, and a profound sadness washed over him. The ghost, the son of the man he had injured so long ago, was not a vengeful enemy, but a tragic pawn. Julian Cross, with the arrogance of a man who held all the cards, took a step closer to the ring. "The crowd is going wild on social media," he said, his voice a low, cruel purr. "They think this is about honor and redemption. They think this is a hero's last stand. They don't know the real story. The final match. The legendary Hulk Hogan, beaten and broken, losing the one thing he ever truly cared about. And all of it, live and unfiltered, for our investors. It's beautiful, isn't it?" He held up the document, the deed to Sunnyside Springs, as if it were a championship belt. The young man who had called himself Ghost stood frozen, his chest heaving, his body language shifting from that of a predator to a helpless victim. Julian's words were a cold slap of reality. He had been so consumed by his father's story, by his own bitter anger, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. His father's memory, his life, his pain, it was all just a useful narrative to Julian Cross. He had been used. He had become the very thing he despised, a cheap spectacle. A new kind of fire ignited in his eyes, not of vengeance, but of betrayal and white-hot rage. You lied to me," he whispered, his voice racking with hurt. He wasn't speaking to Terry. He was speaking to his supposed ally, Julian Cross. "You said this was for my father's honor, for his legacy." Julian scoffed, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Honor doesn't sell, my boy. Vengeance does. We fed you the narrative you wanted to hear. You were the angry son, seeking justice. It was a perfect story. And now you've served your purpose. The legendary hero is on the ropes. The deed is in my hand, and the academy is ours. Thank you for your service." Terry, with a supreme effort, pushed himself to his feet. He staggered, clutching his knee where the ghost's kick had landed, but the physical pain was a distant echo compared to the righteous fury that now coursed through his veins. He looked at the young man, at the raw, vulnerable hurt in his eyes. This wasn't a monster. This was a kid who had been manipulated, his grief exploited. Terry's old persona, the Hulkster, had always been about fighting for what was right, for the little guy. This was the ultimate fight. "He's right, son," Terry said, his voice low and raspy, a stark contrast to his past bravado. He wasn't talking to Julian, he was talking to the ghost. "I was a part of that. I was so focused on the next match, the next title, the next stadium, I forgot about the people who got hurt along the way. Your father, he was one of them. And for that, I am truly sorry." The young man's hands dropped, his fists unclenching. He looked at the worn photograph of his father on the mat, and then at Julian Cross, the architect of his emotional ruin. His mask, once a symbol of his mission, now felt like a lie. With a sudden, violent motion, he tore the black cloth from his face, revealing the features of a young man barely in his 20s, his face etched with a pain far older than his years. His name, Terry recalled from a long-forgotten news clipping, was Daniel. Daniel, the son of David. "My father's name was David," Daniel said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and shame. "And you spit on it. You used his name for a quick buck. You're no different than the people who forgot him. You're worse." Julian Cross's face hardened, the mask of cold amusement slipping to reveal a glimpse of genuine fury. He was losing control of his meticulously crafted narrative. "You're a fool, boy. Get back in the ring and finish the job you were paid to do." But Daniel ignored him. He looked at Terry, at the battered, bruised, but still standing legend, and he saw something new. He saw a man, not a myth. He saw a man with a heavy burden of guilt, but also a man who was fighting for something real, something he truly believed in. He saw a man who, unlike Julian Cross, was not a ghost, but a living, breathing testament to a life well lived, a life of both triumph and failure. He saw a man who was fighting for the same thing his father had been fighting for all those years ago, a chance at a dream. "He's right," Daniel said, his voice now strong and clear, an echo of his father's forgotten hope. "You can't buy the heart of a place. You can't buy the dreams of these kids. This match is over." He turned his back on Terry, walked to Julian, and tried to snatch the deed from his hand. Julian, however, was ready. He shoved Daniel back with a viciousness that sent the young man sprawling. "Don't you dare touch me, you ungrateful little!" Before he could finish, a small, fierce figure scrambled onto the ringside apron. It was Maya, her face a mask of fierce determination. "That's not fair!" she yelled, her small voice echoing with a surprising power. "You cheated! You're the one who started this whole thing!" The other kids, who had been watching in stunned silence, now found their voices. A chant, soft at first, began to build. "Mr. B, Mr. B, Mr. B." It grew louder, a spontaneous, passionate roar that filled the silent, empty arena with a sound that Terry hadn't heard in years. It was the sound of hope. It was the sound of a new generation, fighting for their hero. Terry felt a surge of energy he hadn't thought possible. He wasn't fighting alone. He had an army of teenagers, silent spectators no more. They were his voice, his strength, his reason. He looked at Daniel, who was now grappling with Julian Cross at ringside, and a new plan formed in his mind. "Hey, Shadow!" Terry yelled, his voice now booming, full of the old familiar fire. "You want to play a corporate game? I invented the game. You think you can just come in here and take what's ours? Not on my watch, brother." Julian, distracted by the chaos, looked up, a flicker of genuine concern on his face. Terry, with the agility of a man half his age, launched himself off the top turnbuckle, a move he hadn't attempted in years. He sailed through the air, a red and yellow streak against the dust-filled sunlight, and landed squarely on Julian Cross, his body a powerful, crushing weight. The impact sent a shockwave through the ringside, Julian dropping the deed with a cry of surprise and pain. Daniel, seeing his chance, scrambled and grabbed the document before Julian could recover. The kids at ringside erupted in a deafening cheer, a joyous, triumphant noise that drowned out Julian's furious curses. The referee, an old, grizzled veteran who had been silently watching the entire exchange from the corner, walked over, picked up the deed, and handed it to Terry. The match, he declared, was over. The academy was safe. But Julian Cross was not done. He had been humiliated. But he had not been defeated. He got to his feet, his suit torn, his face a mask of cold fury. "This isn't over, Terry," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You may have won the battle, but you haven't. To won the war. I own the land. I own the building. I'll get an eviction notice. I'll tear that academy down to the ground. You have nothing." And then Daniel, the young man who had been a ghost, a pawn, and now a hero, stepped forward. He looked at Terry, at the kids, and then at Julian Cross, and a small, confident smile played on his lips. "You're wrong," he said, holding up the deed. "He has this, and you're forgetting something. The contract you made with me said that the winner of this match takes all. You were so busy talking about how you owned the land. You forgot to mention that I'm a co-owner of the property, a silent partner, a detail that was conveniently buried in the fine print. And in my contract, it says that if I am ever incapacitated, or if I refuse to fight, the ownership of the property transfers to my opponent. And as you so eloquently put it, I'm now on your side." Terry looked at Daniel, his eyes wide with surprise and admiration. The kid had been playing his own game all along. The kids at ringside erupted in another cheer, a triumphant, deafening roar. Julian Cross's face went from fury to a ghastly, pale shock. He was beaten. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a corporate lawyer, not by a business magnate, but by an old wrestler and a young man with a secret. The Shadow had been defeated, not by a headlock, but by his own arrogance. Terry walked over to Daniel, put a hand on his shoulder, and pulled him into a hug. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel, for the first time in his life, felt a sense of belonging, a sense of bat. He had avenged his father's memory, not with a bitter victory, but with a selfless act of honor. The kids swarmed the ring, their cheers turning into a joyous celebration. They lifted Terry and Daniel onto their shoulders, parading them around the ring, a triumphant procession of heroes and champions. Terry, with a smile on his face and a tear in his eye, looked at Daniel, at Maya, at all the kids, and he knew he had found his new purpose. His final match wasn't about a title, or a victory, or a legacy. It was about redemption. It was about a second chance. It was about finding a family in the most unexpected of places. And it was about a new chapter, not just for him, but for all of them. The ghost was gone. Now, there was just Terry, and a new generation of heroes, ready to write their own stories. But as the cheers faded, and the kids left the arena, a quiet, almost inaudible sound echoed from the far corners of the stadium. It was the sound of a lone, hollow cough. Terry, standing alone now in the center of the ring, his heart full, felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He clutched his heart, his face a mask of pain and confusion. The triumphant smile slowly faded from his lips. He was alone again. The ghost was gone. but the past was still haunting him. He looked up, his eyes meeting the camera, the one that the news crew had set up and left running. His final words, meant for the world, were a single gasping whisper, a final plea, a final lesson, a final warning. And it was a secret he would take to his grave. The camera, a lone, red light blinking in the dimming arena, continued to roll. It captured the final, horrifying moments with stark, unfeeling clarity. Terry Bollea, the man who had faced down giants and stared into the heart of a million screaming fans, was now facing his final, most personal opponent. The pain in his chest was a tidal wave, a crushing, suffocating force that stole his breath and clarity. He stumbled, his legs buckling, and fell to one knee on the canvas. The cheers from the kids outside, the joyous echoes of their victory, were a cruel, distant symphony. They thought they had won. He knew he had just lost. His mind, however, was not on the pain. It was a whirlwind of memories, of moments that had been buried under decades of hype and forgotten. He saw his younger self, a hungry, ambitious kid in a smoky bar, delivering a fateful slam to a man named David. He saw his career, a blur of sold-out arenas, championships, and adulation. He saw the quiet, fulfilling years at Sunnyside Springs, the hopeful faces of Maya, Leo, and Daniel. It was all a tapestry, a complex and beautiful mess, but now, a final, horrifying thread was being pulled, unraveling it all. The Shadow. Julian Cross had called himself that, but Julian was just a puppet, a frontman for a much larger, darker force. Terry remembered the old rumors, the whispers in the locker rooms, the legends of a secret organization that controlled the business, pulling the strings, making and breaking careers. The Shadow was not a private equity firm. It was a conspiracy. The Ghost's father, David, was not just a forgotten casualty. He was a lesson, a warning. Terry's own rise to the top had been allowed, tolerated as long as he played the game. But his turn to philanthropy, his creation of an independent academy, was a deficit. He had become a rogue element, a loose end that needed to be tied up. Julian's entire plan, the theatrical match, the manipulation of Daniel, was not just about acquiring an asset. It was about sending a message that no one, not even a legend like Hulk Hogan, was bigger than the Shadow. He knew he didn't have much time. He was alone, and the camera was his only witness. He had to leave a message, not a farewell, not a final tearful goodbye. He had to leave a warning, a roadmap, a final piece of the puzzle that might, just might, save the kids and the academy. He pushed himself to his feet, a monumental effort that sent a fresh wave of agony through him. He shuffled towards the camera, his movements slow and deliberate, a broken puppet trying to pull his own strings. He looked directly into the lens, his eyes still filled with the fire of a champion, now also held a deep, profound sadness. He wasn't speaking to the world. He was speaking to Daniel. He was speaking to the new generation. "Listen up, brother," he rasped, the words a raw, painful effort. "This is a fix, a work. It's always been a work." The Ghost, David, he wasn't a mistake. He was a message, and I was too blind to see it. This whole thing, it was a setup. Julian Cross, he's a nobody. The real Shadow, they're everywhere. In the boardrooms, in the arenas, in the history books. They're the ones who write the stories, and they're the ones who decide who wins and who loses. The academy, it's not just a gym. It's a symbol. It's a place they couldn't control, so they had to destroy it. But they made a mistake. They gave me a new purpose. They gave me all of you. Look at my hand, brother. Look at my hand. He held up his left hand to the camera, palm open. On his palm, he had written something, a tiny, almost invisible message, a cryptic series of letters and numbers in permanent marker, 36227A. It was his final clue, a last desperate act of defiance. He closed his fist, a final, defiant gesture of a champion, and with a great heaving sigh, he collapsed onto the mat, his body finally giving out. The camera kept rolling, capturing the still, opulent form of the legendary Hulk Hogan, his final words hanging in the air, a ghost in the machine. The kids, now back at the academy, noticed Terry's prolonged absence. The excitement of their victory quickly soured into a cold, creeping dread. Daniel, haunted by Terry's pained expression and final, desperate plea, led the charge back to the arena. They found him on the mat, a still, silent figure in the center of the ring. The scene that followed was a blur of flashing lights, sirens, and frantic calls. Paramedics rushed in, but it was too late. Terry Bollea, the Hulkster, was gone. Daniel, Maya, and the rest of the kids watched in silent horror, their hearts breaking. They had just found a hero, and they had just lost a father. The media storm was immediate and ferocious. News of Terry Bollea's death in a deserted arena just after a miraculous victory became a global sensation. The grainy cell phone videos of Julian Cross's humiliation and Daniel's quick thinking went viral. But no one had seen the full footage. No one had seen Terry's final cryptic message. The news crew that had set up the camera had been forced to leave, and in the chaos, they had forgotten the camera. Daniel, with a heavy heart, returned to the arena the next day to retrieve Terry's belongings. He found the camera, the red light still blinking, and with a morbid curiosity, he played the footage. He watched the final moments, the triumph, Julian's cruel words, and then Terry's collapse. But then he saw it. The raw, unfiltered footage of Terry's final words, his hand held up to the camera, the cryptic message on his palm. "Look at my hand, brother. Look at my hand." The words echoed in the empty arena, a private message from a hero to his heir. Daniel's world, which had just been torn apart, was now given a new purpose. He gathered Maya, Leo, and a few of the other senior students in Terry's office. He played the video for them, showing them the footage of the hand. The kids, who had been grieving, now looked at the screen with a renewed sense of purpose. "What does it mean, Daniel?" Maya asked, her face a mix of fear and excitement. 36-7-18. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but Terry, Mr. B didn't just die. He was murdered. He said it himself. He said this was a fix, a work, and he left us a clue," he lowered, oaked at the kids, his eyes once filled with vengeance, now filled with a quiet, fierce determination. "Julian Cross is just a pawn. The real enemy, the shadow. They're still out there. And we have to find them. We have to expose them. We have to finish what Mr. B started." The kids, Terry's legacy, were now a team. They had a mission. Maya, the computer whiz, took charge of the digital side of the investigation. She started a deep dive into the Sunnyside Springs deed, the legal documents, and Julian Cross's corporate ties. Leo, a natural-born leader and a social media guru, started a quiet, subtle campaign online, using his knowledge of social media to raise awareness about the suspicious circumstances of Terry's death, without revealing their secret footage. And Daniel, the son of a forgotten wrestler, now the inheritor of a legend's final mission, began to look for the physical clues. He started in Terry's office, the place where it all began. He sifted through Terry's old memorabilia, his scrapbooks, his championship belts. He was looking for anything that might relate to the numbers. 36-27-18. It was a strange number, a series of digits that didn't seem to fit into any normal context. Was it a code? A date? A location? The kids, now a united front, pooled their knowledge. Maya, with her tech-savvy mind, suggested they cross-reference the numbers with old wrestling magazines and records. "Maybe it's a date and a match number," she proposed, typing furiously on her laptop, "or a serial number for a contract." Leo, ever the pragmatist, pointed out that the numbers were too simple for a complex code. "It has to be something obvious," he reasoned. "Mr. B didn't have time to be cryptic. He was trying to tell us something quickly. Something we could find without a lot of effort." Daniel, meanwhile, was digging through a dusty box of old newspaper clippings. He found the answer in an old, yellowed photo from the early days of Terry's career. It was a photo of a young Terry, standing proudly in the center of a small local wrestling arena. On the back of the photo, a faded, almost illegible inscription read, "36th and 27th, the 18th State St. Building." The numbers weren't a code. They were an address, the address of the old defunct wrestling promoter's office, a place where Terry had signed his first contract, a place where, Daniel now realized with a cold dread, the Shadow had made their first move. Julian Cross, meanwhile, was not idle. He had been humiliated and beaten, but he was a part of a larger organization, and he had a powerful boss. He received a call, a cold, anonymous voice on the other end. "You failed, Julian," the voice said, its tone a low, menacing hiss. "The asset is still in play. You made a spectacle, you drew attention, and you exposed yourself. You were a pawn, Julian, and you let the pawn take the king. The academy, the kids, they're now a threat. The footage is a liability. Find it. And then burn the entire building down. Leave no trace. We're not taking any more chances." Julian, his body still aching from Terry's final desperate slam, felt a new, more potent fear. The Shadow wasn't just a business. It was a cult, a criminal enterprise, and he had just failed his masters. He knew he had to act fast, not just to save his career, but to save his knee. He had to destroy the evidence. He had to silence the kids. He had to finish the job he had started. He dispatched a team of his most ruthless men to the Sunnyside Springs Academy with explicit orders to find the camera and the kids, and to dispose of both. They were to make it look like an accident, a failure, a tragedy that would be a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to stand up to the Shadow. Julian, meanwhile, was tasked with going to the old office building, the place where the Shadow's roots were planted, to retrieve a master file. A single, incriminating document that detailed the entire history of the organization. The master file was the real prize, the real power. It was the key to the entire conspiracy, and his bosses wanted it gone. The final battle was no longer in the ring. It was a race against time. Daniel, Maya, and the kids were on their way to the old office building, armed with a single cryptic clue, a final message from a fallen hero. They knew the address, but they didn't know what they were looking for. They were just a group of teenagers, a small band of heroes, armed with nothing but their wits and their unwavering loyalty to their fallen mentor. Julian Cross and his men are on their way to the academy, a lit match in their hands. The old arena, the silent spectator to 1,000 forgotten battles, had now become the stage for the final act of a hero's life and a new generation's fight for justice. The spirit of Terry Bollea lived on, not in the cheers of a crowd, but in the fierce, unyielding heart of the kids who were about to become the new heroes of Sunnyside Springs. They were about to face the Shadow, not in a wrestling ring, but in the real world. And this time, the stakes were higher than a championship belt or a deed to an academy. This time, the stakes were their lives. The story was far from over, and the final bell had yet to ring. Bell had buzzed. The old office building was a tombstone to a forgotten era. It stood in a desolate corner of the city, a hulking skeleton of cracked concrete and grimy windows. The once gleaming sign for Atlantic Promotions was now just a rusted shell, the letters long since fallen away. Daniel, Maya, and Leo stood before it, a small band of heroes at the precipice of a great unknown. Their hearts hammered in their chests, a drumbeat of both fear and resolve. They were no longer kids from a youth wrestling academy. They were investigators on a mission, the final desperate hope of a fallen legend. As they approached the entrance, a chilling sound from behind a broken window on the second floor made them stop. It was a rhythmic, scraping noise, like a loose chair leg dragging across a dusty floor. "He's already here," Maya whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and grim certainty. "Julian. He's looking for whatever Mr. B was trying to protect." Their plan, born from a frantic huddle in Daniel's car, was simple and dangerous. Maya, the tech wizard, would go in first, using her small, portable tablet to navigate the building's ancient, rudimentary wiring and find any surviving security systems or data. Leo, the natural leader and muscle of the group, would act as a lookout and backup, ready to create a distraction if necessary. Daniel, armed with the knowledge of a wrestler and the burning need for answers, would be the point man, the one to confront Julian if it came to that. He wasn't afraid of the fight. He was a student of the man who had faced down giants. He was ready. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decaying ambition. The once bustling office was a graveyard of broken desks, overturned file cabinets, and yellowed papers. They moved with the quiet grace of seasoned thieves, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. They found the main office, a large corner room with a massive oak desk in the center. The desk, however, was not where they found their prize. It was in a hidden alcove behind a false bookcase, a secret compartment that only a man with a lifetime of secrets would know about. Julian Cross was already there, his expensive suit now torn and smudged with dust, his face a mask of furious desperation. He was on his knees, his hands frantically sifting through a metal lockbox, a look of pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He hadn't found it yet. The master file wasn't a file at all. It was a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age, its cover embossed with a single black silken S. "The shadow," Maya whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The scraping noise they had heard wasn't Julian searching. It was the sound of a broken lockbox being forced open. He looked up, his eyes meeting Daniel's, and the look of pure relief on his face quickly turned into one of cold, calculating fury. He had been so close, so very, very close. "You kids shouldn't be here," he snarled, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You have no idea what you're messing with. You think this is some kind of game? This is real. This is my life. Now get out of here before you end up just like your pathetic old coach." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He lunged forward, the wrestler's instinct taking over. But Julian was no wrestler. He was a coward. He snatched the ledger from the lockbox and, with a move as swift and vile as a snake strike, threw a handful of rusty nails and screws from a nearby toolbox onto the floor. Daniel, caught off guard, stumbled and fell, his hands and knees hitting the treacherous, sharp debris. He cried out in pain, a cry of both physical agony and emotional frustration. Julian, seeing his chance, scrambled for the door, the ledger clutched tightly in his hand. But he had forgotten about the other two. Leo, seeing his chance, dropped a heavy metal filing cabinet in Julian's path with a grunt of effort, blocking his exit. Maya, meanwhile, was already at the top of a rickety metal staircase, her tablet held high, her eyes focused on a set of wires that snaked across the ceiling. "He's got a backup power supply," she yelled, her voice echoing in the vast empty space. "He's going to try to turn on the old generator to power the main door. It'll give him a head start. I can cut the power, but I have to do it now." The moment was a chaotic, desperate ballet of survival. Daniel, ignoring the searing pain in his hands, scrambled to his feet. Leo, his back pressed against the filing cabinet, was ready for a fight. Julian, trapped between the two, was a cornered animal. He looked at Maya on the stairs, at Leo, at Daniel, and then at the ledger in his hand. The master file was his key to survival. He had to get it out. "Give me the ledger," Daniel demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "It's over, Julian. We know everything. We know what you did to Mr. B. We know what you did to my father. We're going to make sure the world knows what you did." Julian laughed, a cold, humorless sound that rattled the dust from the rafters. "You think that's it? You think you have me? This isn't just a book, kid. This is a list. Names, dates, locations, the real power behind the wrestling world. If this gets out, it's not just me who goes down. It's everyone. You think you're a hero, you're about to be a martyr, and your little academy, it'll burn." Daniel froze. Julian's men, the parallel threat. He had almost forgotten. He had been so focused on this one battle that he had lost sight of the war. But Julian was lying. He was just trying to create a diversion. Daniel had seen the desperation in his eyes, the frantic search for the book, and Julian wasn't a mastermind. He was a pawn, and he was terrified. "You're bluffing," Daniel said, his voice now calm and steady. "You don't have the guts to hurt anyone else. You're just a coward hiding behind a desk." The words hit Julian like a punch. He lunged forward, not at Daniel, but at the ledger. He threw it to the ground, a desperate, final act of destruction. "If I can't have it, nobody can," he screamed, pulling a small metal lighter from his pocket. The flame a tiny, flickering beacon in the gloom. He held it over the leather-bound book, his eyes filled with a manic, murderous gleam. Maya, seeing the danger, acted. She yanked a handful of wires from the ceiling, sending a shower of sparks into the air and plunging the entire building into darkness. The only light now was the tiny, defiant flame of Julian's lighter and the faint, glowing screens of Maya and Leo's phones. In the sudden chaos, Leo lunged, grabbing Julian's arm and twisting it behind his back with the practiced move of a wrestler, a move he had learned from Mr. B. Julian yelped in pain, the lighter flying from his hand and extinguishing in the dust. The ledger, the last piece of a dead man's puzzle, was safe. Daniel, with a swift, powerful kick, knocked Julian's legs out from under him, sending the man sprawling onto the dusty, nail-strewn floor. He landed with a sickening thud, his furious cries muffled by the pain. The kids, in a stunning display of teamwork and courage, had won. They had outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outfought a man who had tried to destroy them. They bound Julian with some old telephone wires, his furious threats and curses echoing in the scant-empty building. They then retrieved the master file, the ledger, and with a shared sense of triumphant, nervous energy, they made their way back to the car. As they drove away, they could hear the distant wail of sirens. Maya, in her last act of defiance, had left an anonymous tip about a fire and a strange man in a torn suit trapped in an abandoned building. The police would find Julian, they would find the evidence, and a long overdue justice would finally be served. The drive back was silent, a period of shared decompression, of quiet reflection. They had faced a real-life villain, a corporate monster, and they had won. They had avenged their mentor, their hero, and they had protected their home. But the victory was bittersweet. They had lost a friend. They had lost a father figure. They had lost Mr. B. Back at the academy, the lights were on, and a small, determined crowd of parents and students was gathered outside. News of Terry's death had already spread like wildfire, and the community was in shock. Daniel and the kids, their faces streaked with dust and their clothes torn, were greeted with a mixture of tears and cheers. They were heroes, not just to the kids they coached, but to an entire community. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, media attention, and a deep, profound sense of loss. The Master File, a shocking testament to a hidden world of corporate greed and manipulation, was handed over to the authorities. It led to a series of arrests, a cascade of dominoes falling as the shadow was finally and definitively exposed. Julian Cross, the pawn, was the first to fall, his corporate empire crumbling around him. The conspiracy was finally brought to light, and the world learned the truth about Terry Bollea, a man who had died a hero, not a washed-up, bitter old wrestler. The memorial service for Terry was a quiet, private affair. No screaming fans, no sold-out arenas. Just a small gathering of the kids he had mentored, the community he had saved, and a few of his old friends from the wrestling world who had been in on the secret of the fix all along. They told stories, they laughed, and they cried. It was a fitting farewell for a man who had traded the roar of the crowd for the quiet love of a community. Daniel, now the de facto leader of the academy, stood at the back of the gym, his eye fixed on the wrestling mat. It was the same mat Terry had taught on, the same mat where he had fallen. The memories, the lessons, the laughs, and the tears all came flooding back. He remembered Terry's first lesson: never give up, never surrender, always do the right thing. And now Daniel knew what that truly meant. It wasn't about winning a match. It was about fighting for a belief, for a person, for a cause. It was about being a champion, not in a ring, but in life. He walked to the center of the mat, his hands now bandaged, still stinging from the fight. He knelt down and, with a deep breath, said a silent prayer. He then stood up, his body straight, his head held high. He wasn't the Hulk. He wasn't the Ghost. He was just Daniel, the new coach of Sunnyside Springs. And he was ready. He looked out at the assembled students, the new generation of wrestlers, the kids who had been given a second chance, a second home, a second family. And he smiled. The final bell had rung. The last match was over. The hero had fallen, but his legacy, his spirit, his bar lived on in all of them. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns of Terry's life had come to an end. But a new story, a new chapter, was just beginning. He knew that the shadow would always be there, a lurking presence in the world, a reminder of the darkness that could consume even the brightest of lights. But he also knew that he and the kids of Sunnyside Springs were ready for it. They were a team, they were a family, they were the champions of the light, and they would never surrender. Never. Not as long as they had each other. The final image, a testament to a life well-lived and a legacy well-honored, was that of Daniel standing in the center of the mat, his hands held high, his face a perfect picture of quiet, confident resolve. The sun streamed in through the old, dusty windows, casting a halo of light around him. It was a new day for Sunnyside Springs, and a new, unexpected chapter for a young man who had found his purpose in the ghost of a legend. The fun, the excitement, the twists and turns had just begun, and they were ready. They were all ready. Now, if you liked this story, give this channel a subscribe and his video a like so that you may get interesting stories like this in the future. Peace out.